Let me tell you exactly what happened on that court. Not the version that ESPN is packaging right now for the casual fan. Not the sanitized, advertiser-friendly recap that protects coaching reputations and avoids the uncomfortable organizational truths that powerful people inside this league do not want discussed on a platform like this one. What happened in that building, what the box score actually reveals when you strip away the noise, the narratives, and the deliberate misdirection, is simultaneously one of the most electrifying individual performances in recent WNBA history and one of the most infuriating examples of institutional self-sabotage this franchise has ever produced. The Indiana Fever lost to the Dallas Wings by 15 points. Final score, 95-80. It was a preseason game, yes. It was not a game that counts in the standings. Every mainstream outlet is going to lean on that qualifier like a crutch, use it to dismiss legitimate structural concerns, and move on by tomorrow morning. Simply explained, does not move on. Because the result, the 5-point margin, the abysmal 3-point shooting, the complete organizational collapse in the second half, is not the story. It never was. The story is what the structure of this loss reveals about the fundamental tensions inside this franchise. The story is what Caitlin Clark's performance in 16 minutes tells us about the ceiling of this team when she is unleashed, and what the rest of the box score tells us about the catastrophic floor when she is not. That is the real story. And nobody in mainstream sports media has the courage, the analytical depth, or frankly the incentives to tell it to you straight. We do. Welcome back to Simply Explained, where the cover story ends and the real story begins. I am not here to make coaches comfortable. I am not here to manufacture false hope for fans who deserve better. I am here to sit with you inside the actual numbers, the actual film, and the actual organizational decisions that will determine whether this Indiana Fever team is a genuine championship contender or an outrageously expensive illusion built around one generational talent who is being systematically failed by every structure around her. Let us get into it.
With 19 points on a 91 true shooting percentage, 2 assists and 1 steal, 2 3-point made, MVP season loading. Let's take a look at some clips. 291 days since Caitlin Clark played in Gainesville. Folks,
the Masterclass nobody is talking about 21 points, 66% shooting from the field, 4 of 6 from the floor, 2 of 3 from 3-point range, 11 of 13 from the free throw line, 4 assists, 1 steal, a scoring rate of 1.3 points per minute against a defensive unit that finished last season as one of the elite defensive systems in this entire league. That is Caitlin Clark's stat line from last night. Now here is the number that should stop every single person reading this cold in their tracks. 16 minutes. She did all of that in 16 minutes of playing time. Let that sit with you for a moment. Really, let it sit. Because what that number tells you, what that rate of production communicates about the scale of individual talent we are discussing, is almost too staggering to process without careful analytical framing. A standard WNBA starter plays between 28 and 34 minutes in a meaningful game. Elite point guards who carry offensive systems, your Sabrina Ionescu, your Diana Taurasi, at their peak, regularly play 32 to 36 minutes when their teams need them. Those are the minutes a franchise-defining player earns and deserves. Caitlin Clark played 16. If you project her rate of production from last night across a standard 30-minute workload, which is not an outrageous ask, it is a basic analytical exercise. She finishes with 39 points against one of the better defensive lineups she will face all season. If you project it across 34 minutes, you are looking at a legitimate 4 or 5-point performance on efficient shooting percentages against an elite defense. That is not a projection built on wishful thinking. That is straightforward arithmetic. And that arithmetic tells you something that should reshape how every serious basketball analyst thinks about this team's potential ceiling. When Caitlin Clark is healthy, locked in, and given the minutes her
2
level
cents
of
to
performance demands,
Stephanie White. Stephanie White, after Caitlin Clark comes out on a heater in the first half, comes out on a heater in the first quarter, keeps that momentum going in the second quarter, sit her down. Why are we going to risk injury? Why are we going to risk health of our superstar?
this Indiana Fever roster has the offensive capacity of a legitimate championship contender. The three-point shot that the lazy mainstream media spent an entire week declaring broken, 2 of 3 last night. 56% from range when she had the ball in her hands and the space to operate, the rust that the talking heads were using as a convenient narrative to justify their absurd preseason rankings, gone. Completely gone. The confidence was visible from the opening possession. She attacked the Dallas defense with her characteristic patience, the way she reads defensive geometry in real time, identifies the driving lane before it opens, and commits to the angle with complete conviction, and she was drawing contact from the opening minutes. 13 free throw attempts. Read that again. 13 free throw attempts in 16 minutes. That is not a player who is tentative. That is not a player who is hesitant. That is a player who is operating at the absolute peak of her competitive aggression and forcing the defensive structure to make impossible choices. And here is the part that infuriates me most about the way this performance is being covered. The mainstream sports media, the same outlets that ranked her 10th on their preseason player rankings, which we will return to in detail, are characterizing last night's game as a collective team failure, a loss, a concerning preseason result for the Fever, full stop. They are technically accurate, and they are analytically dishonest.
Interestingly enough, this was called a flagrant foul. Caitlin Clark goes up for 3. Alana Smith slides her leg right underneath in her landing zone, and it was called a flagrant foul. But take a look, folks. Caitlin Clark coming up limping, coming up hobbling.
Because burying Caitlin Clark's individual masterpiece inside the collective team result is not journalism. It is narrative management. It is the same deliberate obfuscation that this channel was built to cut through. What happened last night was not a collective team failure that happened to include Caitlin Clark. What happened last night was a generational individual performance surrounded by a collective team failure. And those are two categorically different things with categorically different implications for how we evaluate this franchise. Clark did everything that could be asked of her. Everything. She scored at an elite rate. She created for teammates. She shot efficiently. She drew fouls at a rate that would make most scorers in this league envious. And then she was taken off the floor and the team collapsed. That is not a Caitlin Clark problem. That is a Stephanie White problem, a roster construction problem, and potentially an organizational culture problem that runs far deeper than one preseason result. Before we get into the coaching disaster, let us spend a moment on the ESPN preseason rankings because they are directly relevant to understanding the institutional forces that Caitlin Clark and this franchise are navigating. 10th. ESPN's collection of analysts looked at the entire WNBA player pool heading into the 2026 season, deliberated with whatever methodology they use, and concluded that Caitlin Clark is the 10th best player in the league. And then, less than 24 hours after those rankings were published, she walked onto a basketball court and dropped 21 points in 16 minutes against an elite defense.
Oh, she thinks that her spot's on the line or she's competing for a part in the rotation, but Michaela Timpson has been trying her hardest to put in the work and show that she deserves to be a part of this team. 10 points from Michaela Timpson, 4 for 6 from the free throw line, 2 rebounds, 1 steal, 1 block, only 1 personal foul. Michaela Timpson, she should make this roster. Is she going to be a part of the actual rotation? That remains to be seen. Raven Johnson, defensively.
I want to be precise about what I am arguing here, because I understand there are people who will dismiss this as simple Clark fandom or reactionary take generation. This is not that. This is a structural critique about analytical integrity. The question of where Clark ranks among WNBA players in the 2026 preseason is legitimately debatable. There are extraordinary players in this league. The talent level has never been deeper. Reasonable analysts can construct reasonable arguments for why certain players deserve ranking above her based on specific metrics, positional versatility, defensive impact, or historical consistency. But 10th? That is not a close analytical call that fell slightly in the wrong direction. 10th is a statement. It is a deliberate position that requires you to identify 9 WNBA players who project as meaningfully more impactful than Caitlin Clark in 2026. And when Clark then steps onto the court in the first public exhibition of the season and produces what she produced last night against legitimate WNBA competition, against a defensive system designed precisely to limit her, the gap between that ranking and that performance becomes journalistically indefensible. What the ranking actually reveals, if you read it honestly, is the institutional discomfort that exists in certain corners of sports media around Clark's commercial significance relative to her on-court peers. She is the face of the league's most lucrative television deal. She is the primary driver of the explosive ticket price inflation and attendance records that the WNBA is currently experiencing. She generates a volume of media attention that other players who have built their careers and their reputations through years of excellent work, cannot match. And some of the people who cover this sport professionally have decided, consciously or not, to use their ranking systems and their analytical frameworks as a corrective mechanism, as a way of insisting that the commercial reality does not match the on-court reality. Last night was the on-court reality fighting back. Caitlin Clark does not care about the rankings. She does not need to. She has a basketball court and 16 minutes and a Dallas Wings defense to make her argument for her. Now we arrive at the section of this breakdown that is going to generate the most controversy. Because I am going to say something that the mainstream outlets will not say, and I'm going to say it clearly and directly, without the diplomatic hedging that protects coaching reputations at the expense of analytical truth. What Stephanie White did last night was coaching malpractice. I want to define that term precisely, because I am not using it as hyperbole or emotional venting. Coaching malpractice, in the context I am applying it, means making decisions that are objectively indefensible from an analytical standpoint and that expose your franchise to unnecessary risk without any corresponding benefit. It is not a criticism of effort or of character. It is a specific critique of decision-making under pressure. Here is the situation Stephanie White faced in the second half. Her team was down by double digits in a preseason game that has zero impact on regular season standings. Her best player, her franchise player, her billion-dollar investment, the player whose health and availability is the single most critical variable in her team's championship window, had just delivered an elite first-half performance. Her supporting cast had collapsed. The game was, for all practical purposes, over. The correct decision, the decision that any analytically literate, organizationally responsible head coach makes in that exact situation, is obvious. You protect your superstar. You sit her. You tell her the game is done, her work tonight is finished, and you put her in street clothes and keep her warm on the bench. You do not send her back onto a basketball court in a meaningless game against a physical, aggressive defense when there is nothing left to win. Instead, Stephanie White sent Caitlin Clark back onto the court in the third quarter for 2 minutes, in a game the Fever were losing by double digits in the preseason. And what happened in those 2 minutes? What was the direct and entirely predictable consequence of that decision? An opposing player intentionally slid underneath Clark's landing zone during a three-point attempt, compromised the structural safety of her landing, and Clark came down on another player's foot and tweaked her ankle. That ankle injury, which could have ended the season before it began, which could have jeopardized the $2.2 billion television rights deal that is the financial backbone of the entire league's expansion ambitions, happened because Stephanie White chose her ego over her franchise. Players' safety. Let me be precise about what I mean by ego. I do not mean personal vanity in a crude sense. What I mean is the specific competitive stubbornness that causes coaches to refuse to adapt their predetermined game plans even when the circumstances have made those plans irrelevant. Stephanie White had a rotation plan for this preseason game. She had decided, in advance, how many minutes each player would receive, how the lineup substitutions would flow, what she wanted to evaluate in which matchups. And when the game turned into a blowout, and the entire basis for that rotation plan became irrelevant, she could not let go of the plan. She could not look at the situation down by double digits in a preseason game, superstar performing at an elite level, nothing to gain by continued exposure, and make the straightforward adjustment that the situation demanded. That rigidity is a character trait. And, in a head coach, it is a dangerous one. Because here is the reality that every Indiana Fever fan needs to internalize before the regular season begins. The Fever's entire competitive ceiling runs through Caitlin Clark's health and availability. Every game she misses, every quarter she is compromised, every possession where she is not at full physical capacity, the team's championship probability drops measurably. She is not a piece of this team's puzzle. She is the puzzle. Everything else, the roster construction, the offensive system, the salary cap decisions, every organizational decision the Fever make is downstream of Caitlin Clark being healthy and available, which means that any coaching decision that unnecessarily exposes her to physical risk in a meaningless preseason blowout is not just a tactical mistake. It is an organizational betrayal. It is choosing the appearance of competitive normalcy, not wanting to look like you are completely surrendering over the actual competitive future of the franchise. Stephanie White chose the appearance. She got an ankle injury. That is not bad luck. That is the predictable consequence of a predictable decision. We have to talk about what Alana Smith did. And we have to talk about it with the analytical clarity it deserves, rather than the diplomatic minimization that you are going to see from mainstream outlets that depend on league access to do their jobs. At the 7:51 mark of the third quarter, Caitlin Clark elevated to attempt a three-point shot. Alana Smith, who had been beaten on the possession by Clark's ball handling and shooting release, did not attempt a legitimate defensive play on the basketball. Instead, she extended her foot directly into Clark's landing zone. This is a specific and well-documented illegal defensive technique. It is dangerous in a way that is qualitatively different from the ordinary physical contact that occurs in basketball. When a shooter elevates and then comes down onto another player's foot, the entire structural load of their body weight is channeled through their ankle joint at an angle that the joint is not designed to absorb. The resulting injuries are typically severe sprains at minimum, torn ligaments in worst-case scenarios. Players have lost significant portions of seasons, and in some cases, entire seasons, from exactly this mechanism of injury. Smith's foot placement was not incidental. It was not the result of her trying to contest the shot and accidentally ending up in a bad position. If you watch the film with the specific knowledge of what you are looking for, you can see her recognize that she has been beaten, abandon any attempt to contest the shot, and actively position her foot in the space where Clark's feet were going to land. The officials called a flagrant foul. That is the correct call under the rule book. But a flagrant foul in an exhibition game carries no meaningful consequence for Alana Smith or the Dallas Wings organization. There is no suspension mechanism triggered by a single flagrant foul call in the preseason. There is no fine structure that matters at the player level. Smith will walk into the Dallas Wings facility tomorrow morning and go about her preparation for the regular season without any material consequence for what she did. And that is the league's dirty secret. There is a segment of the WNBA's veteran player base that has made a calculated decision about how to defend Caitlin Clark. The calculation goes like this. Clark's elite processing speed, her ability to read defensive structures and find advantages, makes it essentially impossible to stop her through conventional basketball means. You cannot stay in front of her on the perimeter. You cannot contest her shooting release without fouling her legitimately. You cannot prevent her from finding the geometric gaps in your defensive system through effort and positioning alone. So the calculation is, make it physically costly. Send the message early in the season or even in the preseason that playing aggressively against her defense will result in physical consequences. Make her hesitate before elevating. Make her think about the landing before she releases the ball. And if the league's officiating and disciplinary structure does not impose meaningful costs on that behavior, the behavior will continue. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a market reaction to a structural incentive problem. If you can slow down a generational player through physical intimidation at a cost of a flagrant foul call that carries no real consequence, some players will do it. Not because they are uniquely malicious, but because the incentive structure makes it rational. The league has to close this gap. Not because Caitlin Clark deserves special protection as a star. Every player in this league deserves protection from intentionally dangerous play, but because the current consequence structure creates incentives for behavior that is genuinely dangerous and that threatens the physical safety of players at every level. Now, let us talk about the Indiana Fever's response to this incident, because there should have been one. Sophie Cunningham was acquired, at least in part, for her physicality. She is a veteran player who has a specific reputation in this league for bringing a defensive edge and a certain willingness to engage physically in ways that protect her teammates. She was on the floor, or she was available to be put on the floor, in the immediate aftermath of that flagrant foul. What happened? Nothing. No visible response. End quote. No one stepped into Alana Smith's space and communicated without words that this behavior would not go unanswered. No message was sent. I understand that escalation carries risks. I understand that retaliation fouls hurt your team and that protecting your star player by getting yourself ejected accomplishes nothing. These are legitimate, countervailing considerations. But there is a spectrum of responses between doing nothing and getting ejected. Veteran players know where that spectrum is. They know how to make a physical statement without crossing into territory that results in their own ejection. The Indiana Fever, collectively, chose not to make any statement. And Smith will remember that when the regular season begins. The mainstream narrative around this loss is going to center on the absence of Aaliyah Boston, Lexi Hall, and Tasha Harris. And that narrative is partially correct. The Fever were short-handed, and the absence of 3 legitimate rotation pieces created depth problems that the Dallas Wings exploited intelligently. But partially correct is not analytically sufficient, because the roster that was available to the Indiana Fever last night, outside of Caitlin Clark, represented a collection of highly compensated, veteran professional basketball players. And what those players showed us last night was not primarily a depth problem, it was a performance problem. And those are 2 very different things. Let us go through the tape honestly. Sophie Cunningham, 14 minutes of playing time, 0 points, 0 field goal attempts, -16 plus, minus rating, 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 minus rating. Read that again. 0 field goal attempts. Cunningham did not take a single shot. She did not generate enough offensive action to even attempt a field goal in 14 minutes of playing time. She was invisible as a scoring threat, and, as we already discussed, she was absent as a physical enforcer when her point guard was attacked. Now, context matters here. Cunningham is a veteran who understands her role. She was not necessarily supposed to be creating her own offense on a night when the system was struggling to generate anything. but 0 field goal attempts in 14 minutes against a defense that was giving significant ground on the perimeter because they were loading up to stop Clark. That is not strategic restraint. That is absence. The team needed perimeter shooting. The Dallas defense gave it to them. Cunningham did not take it. Kelsey Mitchell, 4 of 12 from the field, 10 points, a staggering -18+ rating. This is the number that should concern the Indiana Fever front office most. Mitchell just signed a $1.4 million contract that represents a significant commitment of the team's salary cap resources. She is, by definition, one of the players the organization has decided it cannot win without. And last night, she was, by the unforgiving mathematics of the plus-minus statistic, the worst player on the floor. -18 is not a bad night. -18 inches a 1-5-point game means that when Mitchell was on the court, the Fever were getting destroyed. It means her presence was actively correlated with the team's worst performance stretches of the evening. It means the Fever were not just losing when she played, they were losing decisively. 4 of 12 shooting tells a story about shot selection. It tells a story about a veteran player who was not getting the shots she needed because the offensive geometry broke down around her, but who also was not making the adjustments necessary to function within a broken offensive structure. Mitchell is a talented player. Her career numbers are legitimate, but last night was not a fluke of circumstance. It was a performance, and it was an alarming one. Dantas, 2 of 11 from the field, 0 for 8 from three-point range, 0 for 8 from 3. Let that land. The Dallas Wings defense was, rationally, leaving significant space for the Fever's perimeter players because they were loading up against Clark's driving lanes and drawing pressure toward the restricted area. Dantas had open looks. She had the kind of open looks that role players in this league build entire careers around converting, and she went 0 for 8 from distance. The team cannot function offensively when the perimeter shooting at that level of volume is converting at 0%. The geometric logic of spacing the entire tactical premise of building a roster around a driving, distributing point guard collapses when the shooters around her cannot make open threes. Every shot Dantas missed was a shot that proved to the Dallas defense that they could continue loading up on Clark without paying a perimeter price. Monique Billings, 1 of 5 from the field. Makayla Timpson, a relatively bright spot, 10 points on 4 of 6 shooting from the free throw line, 2 rebounds, 1 steal, 1 block. She showed genuine energy and competitive effort that the rest of the bench did not match. Whether she earns a consistent rotation spot remains a genuine question, but she made a legitimate case last night. Raven Johnson, the complicated paradox of the evening, 21 minutes, 5 assists, 5 steals, end quote. That defensive performance is real. Johnson's point of attack pressure, her anticipation, her ability to create turnovers at the source of opposing half-court sets is genuinely elite. She has the defensive tools to be one of the better perimeter defenders in this league. But 1 of 3 shooting and 3 points. Her complete inability to be a perimeter scoring threat creates a specific offensive problem that is not just about her own production. When defenders do not have to respect Johnson as a shooting threat, they can position themselves to help more aggressively against Clark. Her defensive eliteness is a real asset. Her offensive limitations are a real liability. And the net effect for an Indiana Fever team that needs perimeter spacing to function is deeply complicated. The aggregate three-point shooting line for the Indiana Fever's supporting cast last night, 17.4%. 17.4% from players making professional salaries against a defense that was conceding perimeter space to stop Caitlin Clark. The Fever's supporting cast went 17% from 3 when the opposing defense was actively inviting them to shoot. You cannot build a championship offense around a generational playmaker when the players around her cannot make open threes at even a marginally acceptable rate. The whole system depends on spacing. The spacing depends on the threat of perimeter shooting. The threat of perimeter shooting disappears When your shooters go 2 of 15 from range on open looks, the whole architectural logic collapses.